But first, after the damage done to the Liberal Party brand at the recent state election by Zac Kirkup, a Green masquerading as its Liberal leader, who didn't just lose the chance of government against incumbent Premier Mark McGowan, he even lost opposition. He lost opposition to the Nationals, who are now the number 2 party in the WA Parliament. Lib's now a veritable rump of just 2 MPs. The Prime Minister today was in Western Australia. It's Scott Morrison's first visit since 2019 to a state that the Liberal Party used to be able to count on as a bit of a blue wall, if you like, on election night. To say the PM has a lot of work to do in the West, well, it's an understatement.
The terror of COVID saw a death rate across the OECD over this course of the last year 34 times greater than that has occurred here in Australia. That means if that death rate was repeated here in Australia, there would have been 30,000 more deaths in this country because of COVID.
Now, as deserving of praise the PM is for his COVID stewardship last year and the fact the rest of the world would want to be where we are in terms of recovery if they could, it doesn't automatically follow that the Morrison government can count on getting a political reward out of this pandemic. It's the brutal reality of politics in this country that it's what's happening today and tomorrow that people focus on, rather than what happened yesterday. And this is where the vaccine rollout, not last year's success, is becoming a big political headache for the federal government. Scott Morrison knows he's got a challenge on his hands. That's why he's asked the so-called National Cabinet to start meeting twice a week again for the first time since May last year. Unfortunately for the federal government, telling the states your troubles doesn't magically fix them, particularly given states like Queensland and WA have now won their elections and Labor leaders are now back doing Anthony Albanese's bidding. In essence, states have had the benefit of COVID incumbency because they've locked us up. We've been told, haven't we? Locked us up to keep us safe. Not so the federal government. You see, it's always easier for government to shut things down than to start them up, to make things more difficult rather than to make them happen. So it's far from clear that the feds will get anything like the same political bounce as state premiers, because their job has been to keep the economy going despite these lockdowns, and now to get the vaccine rolled out despite the fact that there's real supply chain constraints making it all the more difficult. And this latest issue with one vaccine type, AstraZeneca, isn't helping. Of course, to date, the PM and his government has overpromised and underdelivered. There was supposed to have been 4 million vaccinations by the end of March, and everyone willing to be vaccinated was supposed to have been jabbed by October. But because of Europe's vaccine nationalism, the holding back of doses that Australia had ordered and paid for, and now these safety concerns over AstraZeneca, it's meant the government can't say when the full vaccination will be achieved. Given that for more than a year now, COVID has been the only top-of-mind political issue, unfairly perhaps, but that's the reality, this has the result of making the government appear adrift, without a plan. With the PM who's routinely accused of being Scotty from marketing, it's surprising that more thought hasn't gone into this, the rollout. And all the pandemic-driven job keepers, job seekers, job makers, all of them, well, where's the jab maker and jab giver equivalents? Quite rightly, the PM is keen to give us a pathway back to normality. No fear of capricious lockdowns by panicky premiers and steady progress towards the resumption of international people movements that's desperately needed for trade and investment. But at the heart of this is dispelling the climate of fear around COVID. And to do that, it means near universal vaccination. Now, it's a pity that a rare clotting syndrome has somewhat discredited the AstraZeneca jab, and that our local manufacturer, CSL, is currently not geared up to make the Pfizer-style vaccines that rely on gene technology rather than the more traditional type based on a deactivated virus. And it doesn't help either that our public discourse is so bilious, so ready to find fault. The nasty and over-the-top criticism, undeserved, of Jenny Morrison, coming from comedian Magda Szubanski, is just the latest illustration of our inability to maintain a civil public conversation. Still, Scott Morrison himself set the vaccination challenge and his press club speech at the beginning of the year. So it's up to the PM to make it happen. Now, to start with, what about setting CSL the task of gearing up to produce this gene-based vaccine in record time? It'd be a good way, wouldn't it, to demonstrate high-end manufacturing in this country, self-reliance. It'll cost around $100 million, I'm told, to do this. Now, that's a hell of a lot cheaper than international borders remaining closed until 2024, as reported earlier in this week. As well, like it or not, the PM needs to set a vaccine target and each week report progress. Dropping the target a few days ago was a big mistake. I mean, you can't meet what you can't measure. And making all this information available publicly, how many jabs each week, how many jabs, where are they happening, what are the age cohorts, all of that information will help us keep the states and the medicos honest and accountable. Above all else, rather than try and bully people into the AstraZeneca jab when plainly here and around the world there's expert and community concern about it, get more of the Pfizer type into the country and into our arms. It's counterproductive trying to convince people to use a product they don't want, so instead, put the government's energy into more of the product we're willing to accept. Sooner or later, we've got to understand that we can't obliterate risk here, only manage it. Right now, I think Australians, they're still with the PM and they're willing him to fix things and move on to get back to the business of our COVID recovery. But after a difficult few months for the government, the PM's got to give them something to work with. And to be honest, my best advice would be PM, just get on with it.